and welcome to In Their Own Words, the story of the American experiment in the words of the people who made it happen. This is part 2 of the episode on the Constitution. We already answered the question as to why it was needed, and now we're going to address how the Constitution happened. One might assert that the creation of the Constitution was a miracle, given the obstacles in its path. But in the process which gave rise to the Constitution, one can see the guiding hand of the one person whom all Americans trusted, and that person was George Washington. Washington, from his home in Mount Vernon, influenced and enlisted the most gifted men of his time to seek a solution. The path to the new Constitution went through 3 steps. One was the Mount Vernon Conference. The second was the Annapolis Convention, and the third was the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. In March of 1785, Washington invited commissioners from Maryland and Virginia to his home in Mount Vernon to resolve disputes over navigation rights in Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac and Pocomoke rivers. Those disputes were resolved, but the important part is this. The commissioners issued a joint report to the states under Washington's influence, recommending that all the states meet in a convention to take into consideration the trade and commerce of the Confederation. Virginia took the leading role and invited all the states to meet in a convention to address the trade and commerce of the United States. And that convention in 1786 was the Annapolis Convention. They met at Mann's Tavern in Annapolis, Maryland, down the street from the Maryland State House. And that meeting was on September 11th through the 14th of 1786. 9 states appointed commissioners to attend, and yet only 5 states actually sent delegates. Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. But among these delegates were James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Edmund Randolph, and John Dickinson. After 2 days of discussions, the commissioners saw the futility of further proceeding. The trade and commerce of the United States was inextricably tied to the dysfunctional system under the Articles of Confederation. And so, since only 5 out of the 13 states had attended this conference, they made a recommendation to their respective states and to the Congress that a second convention be called for the second Monday in May of 1787 in the city of Philadelphia in order to discuss the situation of the United States. And so the Annapolis commissioners issued their report to their respective states and to the Congress with this recommendation: to procure the concurrence of the other states in the appointment of commissioners to meet at Philadelphia on the second Monday in May next, to take into consideration the situation of the United States, to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. This is a very broad mandate of power for that convention. And the state legislatures were reluctant to cede their power. And so they stonewalled this recommendation in Congress. But the days of control of the national government by state legislatures was coming to an end. Washington wrote to James Madison, 13 sovereignties pulling against each other and all tugging at the federal head will soon bring ruin on the whole, whereas a liberal and energetic constitution, well guarded and closely watched to prevent encroachments, might restore us to that degree of respectability and consequence to which we had a fair claim and the brightest prospect of attaining. John Jay wrote to Washington in early January of 1787, arguing convincingly that neither a state legislature nor the Confederation Congress had the right to ordain a new constitution. That power belonged to the people. No alterations in the government should, I think, be made, nor if attempted will easily take place, unless deducible from the only source of just authority, the people. Once again, Virginia took the lead and appointed delegates to the Philadelphia Convention. Within weeks, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Georgia, and North Carolina followed suit. New York and Connecticut hesitated, concerned that any convention without the consent of Congress might be extra-legal. But by February 21st, the Confederation Congress was compelled to call a convention. But in doing this, they still attempted to retain power in the state legislatures by conditioning that call for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and reporting to Congress the several legislatures such alterations and provisions therein as shall, when agreed to in the Congress and confirmed by the states, render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. The politicians in the state legislatures and the Confederation Congress controlled by them attempted in this resolution to prevent approval of any new constitution which could diminish their power. But they had started a process they could not control. Another 6 states appointed delegates to the Philadelphia Convention, and only Rhode Island failed to participate. And as we shall see, the new Constitution would be ratified by the people, not by the state legislatures. The Constitutional Convention was supposed to begin on May 14th, which is the second Monday in May. But at that date, only the Virginia delegation and some of the Pennsylvania delegation were present. It wasn't until the 25th of May that a quorum was achieved, with the attendance of 9 state delegations with 29 delegates attending. And ultimately there would be 12 state delegations with 55 delegates attending, but they didn't get down to business until the 29th of May after making up rules of how to govern the proceedings. Well, George Washington attended as a delegate from Virginia, and he was chosen unanimously as the president of the convention, not the president of the United States, but as the president of the convention. Virginia had put the delay to good use. It had arrived at the convention with a new plan of government, and on Tuesday, May 29th, Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia submitted 15 resolutions outlining an entirely new form of government consisting of executive, legislative, and judicial branches with a 2-house legislature. The Virginia plan became the focus of heated debates over the next several weeks. The delegates were divided passionately on many issues, but the one question they had to resolve right away was whether or not they were empowered solely to amend the Articles of Confederation, or were they empowered to scrap and replace the Articles with an entirely new system of government which would better serve the interests of the American people. And so on June the 12th, the convention resolved to submit ratification of any new constitution to the people and not to the state legislatures. 3 days later, William Patterson of New Jersey proposed what's called the New Jersey Plan, which attempted to derail this effort and to retain the Confederation Congress slightly improved with more powers, with an executive council and a judiciary. But that plan was rejected 4 days later. And so on the 20th of June, the convention abandoned all efforts to amend the Articles of Confederation and instead devoted all of their energies to creating a new system of government under an entirely new constitution. Now the passions of the delegates were fully aroused, and thank God for their principled passions. James Madison observed the delegates and noted in his journals of the convention that there never was an assembly of men charged with a great and arduous trust who were more pure in their motives or more exclusively or anxiously devoted to the object committed to them than were the members of the Federal Convention of 1787. Imagine yourself confined in Independence Hall in the modest-sized chambers with 54 other delegates in the summer heat and humidity of Philadelphia, with the windows closed to maintain secrecy, all arguing for the survival of your country. Imagine the persistence and devotion of these men to submit themselves to these conditions day in and day out. The most heated discussions at this time were over the voting powers of the two houses of the legislature. The larger states preferred proportional voting based upon population. The smaller states preferred voting by state for fear that they would otherwise lose any influence at all in the government. These two views were irreconcilable, and the convention became deadlocked and was on the brink of failure. So they adjourned to celebrate the 4th of July, and during that time, cooler heads prevailed and came up with a solution. And so Roger Sherman proposed what is now called the Great Compromise, where we would have one house of the legislature, which we now call the House of Representatives, elected by proportional vote by population. The second house, which we call the Senate, would have equal votes by state. And this Great Compromise was approved by the convention on July 16th, and the convention was saved. The whole plan of government was based on the principles of the separation of powers and checks and balances by the branches of government against each other. James Madison in Federalist Number 51 spoke of the challenges to have a strong central government without endangering the freedoms of the people. And he said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. The whole point was to fragment power so that no one group could endanger the liberties of the people. Under the separation of powers, the legislative power to make laws resided in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And even this power was fragmented so that some legislative authorities were vested in the House and others in the Senate. For example, only the House could initiate legislation to spend money, and only the Senate could ratify judicial appointments made by the executive branch. The executive power was vested in the President of the United States to execute and to enforce the laws passed by both houses of Congress. The judicial power was vested in the Supreme Court and such inferior federal courts as Congress created. The judicial power was to interpret the law and to administer justice. The principle of checks and balances employed the powers of each independent branch of government to restrain the use of power by the other co-equal branches. For example, the Congress could pass laws, but the President could veto those laws. But then again, the Congress could override the veto with a 2/3 majority in both houses. The President could nominate Supreme Court justices, but the Senate had to confirm them. The Supreme Court could declare laws unconstitutional, but the Congress may amend the Constitution by a supermajority of 2/3 vote in both houses. The system breaks down, however, and our liberties are imperiled when one branch of government usurps the authorities of another branch. For example, when a court tortures the interpretation of a law in order to achieve a desired result, it usurps the authority of the legislature. It is rewriting the law and placing its judgment superior to the judgment of both the Senate and to the House of Representatives by one person, and that person was never elected by anybody. Further to fragment power, delegates of the convention staggered the terms of office for elected officials. Members of the House of Representatives were elected for 2 years, presidents for 4 years, senators for 6 years, and even then, only a third of the Senate was elected every 2 years. Frequent elections turned power back to the people at every election cycle. By June 26th, the Virginia Plan had evolved over many, many changes. into a draft constitution. And so the convention adjourned for 11 days to allow the Committee of Detail to go through all of the amendments and to put together one document which reflected all the changes that had been made at that point. Then on August 6th, that document was presented back to the convention. And for more than a month, the delegates to the convention went line by line, making changes on the run as they went along. By September 17th, the final document was ready. As a compromise document, the Constitution was not loved universally. Good compromises always dissatisfy. And resistance to signing the final document was widespread. Even on the last day of the convention, September 17th, there was great danger that many of the delegates would reject the final document and refuse to sign it. In his last great service to America, the aged and infirm Benjamin Franklin addressed the convention. He was too weak to stand very long, so his friend and colleague James Wilson of Pennsylvania read his speech in his presence, and his wisdom and logic were unassailable. He concluded his speech as follows: "It therefore astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does, and I think it will astonish our enemies who are waiting with confidence to hear that our counsels are so confounded like those of the builders of Babel, and that our states are on the point of separation, only to meet hereafter for the purpose of cutting one another's throats. Thus, I consent, sir, to this Constitution, because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best." And he concludes, "On the whole, sir, I cannot help expressing a wish that every member of the convention who may still have objections to it would with me on this occasion doubt a little of his own infallibility, and to make manifest our unanimity, put his name to this instrument." Well, Franklin saved the day. 38 of the 41 delegates present on that day signed the Constitution of the United States of America and sent it to the states for state conventions elected by the people to ratify it. They also sent copies to the Confederation Congress. The new United States government would be invested with the full sovereignty and powers of the American people. We, the people. 5 states quickly ratified the Constitution, but it took ratification by 9 states to make the Constitution effective. And the sticking point was the absence of a Bill of Rights that would forbid the government from overstepping its bounds and endangering the freedoms of the people. Now, Federalists like Madison and Alexander Hamilton argued that there was no need for a Bill of Rights because the federal government only had those powers which were extended to it, granted to it, under the Constitution. But anti-federalists like Patrick Henry and George Mason argued that governments never respected the bounds on their authority and always attempted to wield more power than was proper. And so that a Bill of Rights was essential in order to safeguard the liberties of the people against government overreach. Remember that the design of the Constitution was to restrain the very government which it created. And so many people were influenced to approve the new Constitution by 85 powerful and persuasive essays written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, and published widely in newspapers under the pen name Publius. And these essays today are collectively known as the Federalist Papers. And we will hear a lot more about the Federalist Papers in another episode in the future. Massachusetts refused to ratify the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. And so, under the promise that the first Congress of the United States under the Constitution would amend the Constitution to include a Bill of Rights, the ratification process continued. The 9th state to ratify the Constitution was North Carolina on June 21st, 1788. And at that point, the Constitution sprang to life. Elections were held, and on the 4th day of March of 1789, the new Congress of the United States of America under the Constitution took power from the Confederation Congress, and the term of the new government began. Rhode Island would be the last state to ratify the Constitution on May 29th of 1790. And so on December 15th, 1791, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we know as the Bill of Rights, were adopted. While the delegates were signing the Constitution on September 17th, on the last day of the convention, Benjamin Franklin turned to those around him and made a few comments, which were recorded by James Madison. And the conversation concerned George Washington's chair, which he sat in during the convention, and that chair had on its back an engraved sun on a horizon. And Franklin made these comments: "I have often in the course of the session, and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president, without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." So for you younger Americans who are about to become the stewards of our Constitution, please keep the sun rising. That's our episode for today. And that's the end of part 2 of our episodes on the Constitution. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, would you please share it with your children, your grandchildren, your family, your friends? Share us on social media. Give us a thumbs up. And make comments if you'd like. Thank you for watching. God bless you.